But we have, our goal is just to give you a couple of updates about where we are with some of the federal changes and kind of what we're trying to do to keep up with them. Same with the education stuff. And, I know that the analogy has been overused in the last 9 months, but this drinking from a fire hose feeling is not going away anytime soon, I think. So, it was just a year ago, we didn't know the results of the 2024 elections, believe it or not. So a lot has happened in this last year. And we're really kind of thinking about just wrapping our heads around all these changes and trying to help other people wrap their heads around it too. So I want to kind of start with the 5 questions that we are thinking about with regard to any public policy approach, right? The 5 questions that we kind of start with are first, what problem are we trying to solve? Who gets to decide what the solution is or what policy change might be? Third, who benefits from the change? 4, who's left out or left behind from the change? And 5, who pays for the change? So those are the questions, the kind of framing we're approaching a lot of these, like what are we paying attention to and how to narrow down what we're paying attention to. So I think when we apply these questions to both of these topics, it helps us kind of wrap our heads around um, what to pay the most attention to. So I think on many of the changes at the federal level, the answers to these questions are pretty straightforward, right? Well, maybe not what problems exactly they're trying to solve, but I think we're pretty clear about who benefits and who left out or left behind, right? The administration is clearly slashing programs that support low-income families in favor of tax cuts that benefit the rich. And the legislative branch is largely going along with whatever the executive wants, so that self-interested billionaires with seemingly kind of endless conflicts of interest are making all these decisions. Again, pretty clear who's left out, right? Low-income families, immigrants, asylees, refugees, among many others. And then on the public education, what they're calling the Transformation Bill Act 73, we're thinking about how to grapple with these questions as a state. I think the bill is making no secret of the intent to consolidate decision making, with the state making the central spending decisions and fewer districts and school boards weighing in. But I think the answers to the rest of the questions kind of flow from the first 2 questions, right? What problem are we trying to solve, and who gets to decide what the changes are? So I think many legislators would probably say that the problem that they're trying to solve is they want to see more resources directed to kids who need them. I think others are pretty focused on spending less, including the administration, and some are sort of trying to figure out how to solve the tax problem, which is, feeling like property taxes are harming low and middle income Vermonters, but not really knowing what if they can do that if spending cuts are the only way to do that, only way to accomplish that, right? And I think where we still are, unfortunately, with this bill is that there's a lot of unanswered questions. There's still more questions than answers, even with kind of a few months to absorb what's in it and look at what's proposed. Not a lot of it is not final. A lot of it depends on other steps along the way. And so the devil's really in the details. So until we see what the districts are, until we see what the foundation amount is, what the inflator will be, what the second home tax rate will be, funding, how we pay for school construction, all those questions, it's really tough to figure out who's benefiting from these changes, if people are benefiting from the changes, who's paying for them, and who might still be left out of the changes. So with those questions in mind, I think I'm going to turn it over to Katrina to just kind of give the latest of what we've been thinking about regarding the federal shutdown and the policy changes there. And then she'll kick it back to me for some of the school stuff. And then, like I say, small group, so happy to just engage in conversation after that. Go ahead, Katrina.
Great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Also, just a disclaimer from the beginning, I am very pregnant. So if you hear me like gasping for breath throughout this, it's because my lung capacity is limited. So bear with me on that. All right. So as Steph mentioned, I am going to provide an overview of the work that Public Assets is doing in terms of tracking federal actions, and specifically using data to look at how some of these actions are impacting Vermont and Vermonters. So first, just an overview of the federal funds flowing through the state budget. You can see that Vermont in fiscal year 2025 received around $3 billion in federal funding. Most of this went to healthcare, specifically Medicaid, but public education and transportation also receive fairly substantial federal funding that's flowing through the state budget. Of course, the state budget is not the only place that these federal funds are flowing. This is a snapshot in time of federal funds flowing into the state to any entity in fiscal year 2024. So you can see that about $4 billion went to individuals, and most of this was Social Security payments. There's also hundreds of millions of dollars going to local governments as well as nonprofits directly. I say that this is a snapshot in time because this has changed. As you all know, there's been federal funding freezes, there's been federal funding cancellations, cancellation of grant programs, cancellations of projects in the state. So these numbers have been evolving and shifting. Um, a lot of these cancellations have later been reversed either by the administration itself or by courts. So it's very hard to track in the data. So that's mostly a caveat that these numbers have shifted. We're continuing to track, these federal funding cuts at the executive level, but it's hard to track within the data just because they are constantly shifting and it's just very unstable. So in addition to the executive level cuts and pauses, there's also congressional level cuts. So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA, was passed in July. One of the programs that was targeted was nutrition assistance, known as Three Squares in the State. And this included expanding work requirements for the program, kicking off certain groups of immigrants like refugees, and then also shifting certain costs to the state. So all of these changes together are expected to cause around 16,000 Vermonters to lose some or all of their Three Squares benefits. We'll have more information on this once the SNAP data for October comes out, which should be November or December. We'll be able to gauge what the impacts of these cuts from OBBBA really are in the states and what might be needed to address some of these losses. Medicaid is another one that we saw cut through OBBBA. I always forget one of the B's, OBBBA. Medicaid makes up about a quarter of Vermont's budgets. Similarly, OBBBA instituted work requirements, kicked off certain types of immigrants like refugees, and made paperwork harder for enrollees, all of which is expected to cause around 14,000 Vermonters to lose Medicaid. A lot of these changes won't go into effect until 2027. So we won't have updated data necessarily on the impacts to the state beyond initial estimates of the number of Vermonters who are at risk of losing Medicaid, as well as funding losses to the state. Okay, so you have executive level federal funding freezes, federal funding cancellations, congressional cuts, and then to add to the instability, there's also the mass layoffs of federal workers. The most recent data we have is from March 2025. It shows us that there are roughly 6,600 federal workers in Vermont, primarily working for these three agencies you see in front of them. And then on top of potentially being at risk of being laid off at any moment, we're also in the second longest government shutdown of all time. And what that means is that many of these federal workers are also experiencing working without pay right now or being furloughed, which means being put on temporary leave. So there's that kind of double whammy of instability for the 6,600 federal workers in Vermont. The main issue at play with the or I should say one of the main issues at play with the shutdown is the expiration of the Affordable Care Act premium credits. So what this is, the enhanced premium credit, which is set to expire at the end of the calendar year, expanded existing subsidies for people who are making under 400% of the federal poverty level, as well as expanded the credit to include people who are above 400% of the federal poverty level. So if these credits expire, they'll go away in entirety for those making over 400%. There's around 30,000 Vermonters who currently receive this credit. For an individual, that would mean, at 400% FPL, you're making over $63,000. You will likely in Vermont see your premium double, go up by $10,000. And for a family of four, you could see it triple, going up by the numbers hidden by the panel by $32,000. So very, very substantial. And I think it's $65 million total in federal funding that Vermont receives for these credits. So the last thing that I haven't touched on is the tax cuts. OBBBA permanently extended some of the 2017 tax cuts aimed at the wealthiest Americans and added additional incentives for the wealthiest. This could be an opportunity for Vermont to recoup some of this money. In Vermont, the top 20% are expected to receive over $700 million in tax benefits. So again, this could be an opportunity to recoup it at the state level and address some of these program cuts that we're seeing now or we're expecting to see come down the pipeline. And that is my very depressing overview. Back to you, Steph.
Thanks, Katrina. Yes, Katrina has had to be the bearer of bad news on a lot of this, but um, that is as quick a snapshot as we can give of the what's going on at the federal level. Obviously, there's a whole lot at stake in the shutdown. You know, we're experiencing, I know a lot of people are experiencing temporary pauses, but then there's also these sort of already permanent changes, cuts, erosions. One of the things we're paying a lot of attention to is there's a lot of data that we can't access right now. So the census cite a lot of other things, but there are also some data that are just not being collected right now, some of the monthly jobs data and other things. And whether that shifts permanently or not, we also know maybe particularly pertinent to Vermont right now and to the education work is the fact that the federal government has gutted the National Center for Education Statistics from a total of 100 employees down to two. And those are permanent layoffs. So that's already been decimated and they're no longer able to and that's sort of the only imperfect but best source of data that we have, comparing states' education spending and enrollment and all those kind of things that would be useful in any education changes going forward. So lots of real losses already happening and lots of coming additional cuts as well as just the ongoing and no end in sight instability of the shutdown. On the education front, I think, I know I've talked to a lot of all of you about these things over time, so I don't want to kind of, um, belabor too much of this, but I think there's just a couple things that I would bring up in terms of what we're thinking about with Act 73. And then I want to give a relatively quick and high level update of what the redistricting task force has been up to this point. They just met, I think, for the sixth time, maybe yesterday. But also their work is wrapping up. So, that piece is happening quickly, probably more quickly than really is ideal, but and then kind of go from there. So I think again, we have both a federal resource hub, which has a lot of the information that Katrina shared, and we will continue to update over time. We also have this education resource hub, which has, I think, some useful side-by-side comparisons of what Act 73, which was just passed, which is the transformation bill that was just passed, and current law and kind of comparison and some more background information on a lot of this stuff for people who are interested. I think Becca will probably drop those links in the chat or will point you to them at some point. Um, so just to kind of kick off, like I think for a lot of people, for public assets, our read of the response to the FY25 school budgets and the tax increases that flowed from those was that people were interested in tax relief. Most Vermonters were interested in school tax relief and not necessarily calling for wholesale change for schools. But with that said, I also recognize that there's a whole range of concerns about our schools, right? I think some people are really concerned about how kids are doing. Are they getting the resources they need? Are there particular groups that aren't getting the resources they need? I think there's definitely concerns about how teachers are doing, educator turnover, certainly concern about the infrastructure needs, the sort of infrastructure needs that have been piling up that we haven't been really dealing with, and how to pay for those with our school buildings. And certainly like how much we spend as a state, whether we're spending it wisely. So there's a lot sort of as voters, parents, taxpayers, even, for us as data analysts to kind of wrap our heads around what doesn't always feel like a very coherent story about what we're seeing and what we're hearing. But I think there is broad agreement on the need for tax relief, for school tax relief and the recognition that not all kids are getting what they need. So the points of divergence in this conversation really seem to be one, whether tax relief necessitates spending cuts, which is a big question. We would argue that it doesn't, that you can solve the tax problem without the spending cuts, which is not to say that we can't spend more efficiently, but it's just to say that it's not necessary to fix the tax problem. And then the second question is whether more state control will achieve both lowering the spending and somehow get all kids what they need. And those to me are sort of the big two questions that kind of, depending on where you land on those questions, really determine what you think the policy direction should be of public education. So our concerns really fall into three main buckets. The first, and you probably heard me harp on this before, the concerns about what the bill doesn't do, right? The two big things that the bill doesn't do in our mind is address the biggest cost drivers that drove a lot of the spike in FY25 and have been driving increases in school costs for a while, and not solving what's unfair about the tax system now, which is both the regressivity and how the taxes are hitting low and moderate income Vermonters. So from our perspective, those are really the issues that are driving tax bills too high, school tax bills too high for a lot of people. So again, more about the distribution, not about the total spending. And I think that does mean that we can solve the tax problem without this major overhaul and transformation. But it also means that we need to deal with the cost drivers before we do anything else, right? The second bucket of our concerns is really about the bill's ability to deliver what past reforms have failed to accomplish. So without good data and evaluation of Acts 46, Acts 46, 173, and 127, which were the prior consolidation efforts, the reforms to special education, and the changes to pupil weighting, respectively, we really don't know whether any of this will accomplish the goals. Again, that's assuming that we all have the same goals, that we're all trying to solve the same problems, which I think is probably not true, is a pretty big assumption. The third area of our concerns are about the immediate effects of the upheaval of these changes on kids and educators. We're certainly already seeing districts think about closing schools preemptively, start these conversations about merging and changes and all these things. The school system's really still reeling from the multi-year effects of the pandemic and not to mention all these changes in education that we're facing at the federal level. So adding this kind of large scale self-imposed chaos to the mix, I think we have to ask ourselves if it does more harm than good, or if there's a different timeline that we could apply to this to make it less disruptive and less harmful to kids in schools. So quick update on the where the redistricting task force is, and Katrina has been faithfully following it, so she can jump in and correct me if I get any of this wrong. But the big picture is that they're narrowing it down to kind of three approaches to new maps. And I think they have two meetings left, and the goal is to really choose the maps by at the November 10th meeting. So the kind of three versions of these maps, one really revolves around the career and technical education regions, right? So really driven by that. So that results in I think the most recent version was 13 regions, but really kind of operating off of those current CTE regions. Some concerns about that is again, there's a range of what those regions look like, both size-wise and what they're able to deliver, and how those centers operate or don't, and what other entities within those regions might be offering some piece of these services. So I think there's a lot of questions about that piece. There's also that also sort of leaves the question of what does that mean for governance? That might be the region, but then what does that mean for who makes the decisions? What do the school boards look like? Alongside this redistricting task force, there's also this voting ward group that is supposed to be looking at these questions, like what school boards would you have in each of these scenarios, and how does that change from what we currently have? The second option is really revolving around this notion of BOCES, which are, let me see if I get this right, Board of Cooperative Educational Services, which is something that we've been thinking about. It's something that's in use in New York. And it's really about pooled services and sort of a regional approach to some of the services. But I don't know that we have a very clear idea or a clear map of what exactly that would look like. What services are most likely to be regional? What services are required? Are there any requirements? Is it all sort of voluntary basis? What does this look like? So I think that's part of the question with that. So sort of how that differs from some of the operational structures we already have, that's sort of part of the question that we're trying to understand where they're going to land with that. But alongside that BOCES model, there's also what they're calling kind of strategic mergers, which is, I don't think anybody is saying that we have the right number of districts now. I think there's, again, sort of broad consensus that there's probably a few places where we could still consolidate some districts and communities that are probably willing to do that, and interested in exploring that. But um, but it may be a longer process, and to get buy-in may take more. And part of this is sort of looking at, so what are the criteria that we use to decide that? Who gets to decide? And then what sort of goes into making those decisions about what makes sense? Is it places where enrollment has dropped by a certain amount? Is it places where there's space in the school buildings? Sort of what goes into making those decisions. The third kind of possible avenue for consolidation is what they're calling this regional comprehensive high school model, which, again, we can kind of drop the links to the maps and the various, again, these are all draft form, all kind of TBD final versions. But this idea that we have regional comprehensive high schools, and again, I think some of the big questions around that are, and some of that would also kind of use some of those career and technical education regions to kind of work off of, but would probably create between 19 and 21 regional centers. Whether you call them districts remains to be seen, but sort of mapping in that range. And I think the biggest questions there involve, how do you get, you know, even close to a standard size, knowing that some areas of the state are much more rural, and what that looks like. Also, what do you need for new school buildings and or expansion to current school buildings? So those are sort of the three paths. And again, the fast track of this is really to make decisions about these on November 10th. But then the suggestions just sort of go as recommendations to the legislature. And I imagine that the task force will also have, as part of their report, other questions that the legislature would need to answer, other information that might be helpful in sort of pointing directions, and or potentially recommendations about possible timelines or questions and concerns about those timelines. Katrina, do you want to add anything to that? Did that feel about probably more information than anybody wanted?
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay. So just to kind of give you a real quick summary of what we're working on at Public Assets to approach some of the answers to these questions, keeping these hubs updated both on the federal front and the education front, is the goal, is sort of the location for a lot of this stuff. But particularly on the education funding questions, we're working with a lot of partners across the state. I think there's a lot of concerns. I think there's a lot of groups that share some of these concerns, all of these concerns, or have their own concerns. Some of the rural areas and or, um, just other groups that are concerned about who's making the decisions and the democratic elements. Lots of angles here. But what we're working on is really trying to get as much kind of fact-based analysis into the conversation as possible on the front end. Well, maybe this isn't the front end, maybe this is sort of the middle, but try to get as much information before the next legislative session. So we're hoping to have out this week are updated town-to-town maps that give you per pupil spending and town tax rates and how you compare to the state average over time over these last few years. And part of the goal with that is for people to be able to see kind of the arc of the 25 changes. So I don't know if people really appreciate how much changed in 25. The definition of pupils, how we calculate per pupil spending, how we just how we calculate poverty. So your before and after between 24 and 25, it's really apples to oranges, and we're trying to make those more apple to apple, right? Like give you a better sense of what those changes mean. So for example, we change the definition of poverty. All of a sudden, we have a whole lot more kids in poverty. That means our per pupil spending has actually gone down in places where there's more kids in poverty, but I don't think we would say that's a good thing, right? So there's just a lot of moving parts, and we're trying to help make sense of some of those moving parts and make that information clearer. The other piece that we're working on is some case studies about per pupil spending. So there are plenty of districts or towns that spend similar amounts per pupil, but it doesn't mean that they have the same ability to offer things to kids, right? So depending on what your mental health care needs are, depending on what your past debt is, depending on all kinds of things. So I think we're just really trying to get people to wrap their heads around the range, like what per pupil spending does and does not tell us. right? I think there's been a lot of focus on that as there being one right number for that. And I think it's really kind of glossing over a lot of the nuance and the differences in some of these things. Um, part of, and I know, and Carlin can jump in here too. I know Voices is also doing some work on this, I think, and other partners as well. This is less public assets area of expertise, but I think something that's really important to the conversation is how do outcomes map onto spending and or not, right? A lot of the conversation has been around lifting up those low spenders, but in our work, a lot of our analysis has showed that the low spenders aren't necessarily the same year after year, number one. Number two, with all of the changes to the definitions, we're trying to figure out if the weighting changes did much or if we really haven't let them work yet, will they change how much districts spend over time? Because the whole goal of the weighting changes was to solve this problem of getting resources to the groups of kids that are getting left behind. So I think there's a whole lot of questions, and there's a bunch that we're working on. We're also working on, of course, on understanding the cost drivers over time, how much that you might have just seen a report on healthcare. Katrina called attention to this, to the cost of healthcare in Vermont, but that's certainly affecting our school budgets in a pretty big way. Um, the other piece is looking at some of these tax changes, getting away from what the income sensitivity system we've had for a long time and moving to a homestead exemption system that really leans more into the property tax and basing your school taxes on property value than the current income sensitivity system does. So there's a whole lot of moving parts that we're trying to track. Um, with that said, I think these conversations have a couple of things in common. So first, clear need for good data. In all these places, we're losing a lot of access to data at the federal level, and whether that continues to get collected or not, these are questions. Without federal jobs data, census data, it's really tough to know what's happening. And those data also dictate where the dollars flow at the federal level. So there's real harm that follows the absence of that. And similarly, in the public education conversation, there's there are a lot of data that we just don't have, that we can't, these questions that we can't answer. And so it's really tough to know what the solutions are if we don't know where districts are putting their money now, um, and how what their outcomes look like relative to their spending, and how much of this is really just sort of unproven assumptions versus real problems that we're trying to solve. I think another common theme here is the need for robust public services, right? What are our collective commitments? I would say public education is sort of the most, healthcare and public education are the two biggest things the state does. How well are we doing them? Public education is sort of this example of maybe the most obvious example of a collective good that we all support, recognizing that who benefits are the kids and therefore all of us, right? So I think that's another piece of this. And then I would also argue that I think both of these conversations really illustrate the need for public input and engagement. The question of who decides what to do is maybe at the heart of both of these conversations. I think at the federal level, we're really seeing the harm of a powerful few making decisions without regard for the needs or the wants of the many. And then at the state level, we're poised to cede a whole lot of control over schools to the state and get rid of a whole lot of democratic engagement. So we kind of need to decide if that's the direction we want to go, if we think that's the best way to solve the problems that we're seeing. So with that, I think we've done a fair amount of talking at you and would love to hear where you are, what questions and or concerns on any of these topics or others that have been coming up.
And Carlin had a question in the chat, but Carlin, I'm very happy to take you off mute. You can unmute yourself and ask the question with your voice if you'd like, or I can read it out loud if you want. There you are. Cool.
Hey, thanks. Well, it's probably too soon to be able to answer my question, which is the impact of the federal cuts to special education. But I wanted to put it in there as maybe as a placeholder for all of us to try to grapple with that question. Just add it to the list of the federal impacts.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Carlin. I think, Katrina's original spaghetti chart, the one we call the spaghetti chart, it's interesting because two biggest things we do as a state, healthcare and public education, healthcare majority paid for with federal dollars, public education majority paid for with state dollars. But the federal pots that go into education are very specific and very targeted for purposes of getting resources to particular groups of kids that need them. So those losses hurt, those potential losses hurt very targeted populations. And I think it is something we can keep an eye on. So yeah, I think you're right. You answered your own question, which is that we don't really know, but it is something we're keeping an eye on and recognizing that even though those federal dollars are a relatively small part of the public education dollars, they're critical for certain populations.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that we have seen though. The administration has gone after the Department of Education specifically for mass firings, and I believe has intentionally targeted people who generally administer these dollars. So that would be one threat, not so much in terms of cuts, but just in terms of getting the dollars out the door. And then, I think what we are expecting to see, who knows what will happen, but what we are expecting to see is a continuing resolution. So a carrying over at this point of fiscal year 2024 federal funding levels for programs, with federal special education funding being a discretionary pod that would be included in that. And while it may not explicitly include cuts, it does not account for inflation. So for some of the sectors that are seeing higher rates of inflation, it will mean a certain level of cuts. So we have this chart here. You can see education is a little bit higher than all items in terms of the inflation that it saw between August of 2024 and 2025. So again, CRs typically don't account for inflation, so it translates to some level of cuts, though of course, maybe not what we saw in the House budget proposal or even the Senate budget proposal, though I haven't been tracking them specifically. But it's a really good flag and definitely something that we will continue to keep tracking.
Thanks, Carlin. Jared, you should be able to unmute yourself and you can go right ahead.
Thanks, Becca. Can you hear me? Great.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I just want to say is thank you, Steph and Katrina and Becca and anybody else from the public assets team that contributed to this. As difficult and distressing as a lot of this news is, it is encouraging that we can rely on public assets to make sure that Vermont's conversation, both about what's the federal impacts and about what's happening with education funding, are starting with the latest information and facts and evidence that we have to be able to lead to constructive deliberation. So great presentations. Thank you for tracking and presenting it in such an organized, clear way. One question I had at the beginning, Steph, you had said that and I really loved the framework of being explicit about the 5 questions that you're starting with and what that framework is, and that starting with the question, what problem are we trying to solve? And I think that's especially important when it comes to property taxes and education funding, because it seems that a couple of things have been, to me, it seems like a couple of things have been conflated in the public conversation. And I think that one of the things you said gets at the heart of that, which is there is a difference between a goal of delivering tax relief and a goal of either driving consolidation or disinvesting in public education in Vermont. And I think that you said, look, it's possible that you can do one without the other. And I think for a lot of folks, that seems counterintuitive or surprising. Based on being able to read Public Assets' great work, it seems that the clear way that we can do that is by working to make the way that we fund education in Vermont more progressive, focusing more on those with ability to pay and providing tax relief to those with less ability to pay, whether long term that's with more substantial reforms and moving more towards an income-based system, or in the short term, as public assets recommended last year, updating the income sensitivity thresholds. And so that the folks with the least ability to pay could see that tax relief shifting more towards folks with ability to pay so that it doesn't necessarily have to coincide with um, a significant drive to consolidation and or disinvestment in public education in Vermont. But to me, I continue to be surprised, and maybe it's because I'm looking at it from a rational perspective rather than a political perspective, that in the political conversation, we're not disentangling those two things. It has felt like there are folks whose starting point was not tax relief for the folks who wanted it, but a pre-existing goal of driving significant consolidation and disinvestment in public education in Vermont. And so we're using the very legitimate and important concerns, especially among lower and middle income folks, of a need for tax relief to then say, well, the only way to provide that is significant consolidation and wide-scale disinvestment in public education. But public assets analysis has shown that that's really not necessarily the case, that we can provide tax relief to those who need it without the second. And so I'm just really grateful that you're pausing to say, what is the goal here? And how are we conflating things in this conversation that don't need to be conflated? And so, sorry, it's a long way of just expressing a lot of appreciation, but getting to a question: do you see a way forward in this session to better disentangle those things, whether it's a renewed push to update income sensitivity or to inform the efforts that you were talking about of a homestead exemption approach versus income sensitivity, so that we can squarely focus on tax relief for those with the least ability to pay, rather than continue to kind of have that as secondary to this broader conversation about significant consolidation and disinvestment.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things you bring up a couple of points, and thank you for the kind words as well. But I think there's a couple of points that I want to make. One is I think it depends on who you ask whether or not the goal is lowering costs. I think there's a lot of people, maybe particularly in the House, who would say that bending the cost curve is the goal, right? Like not necessarily cutting immediately. I think we've seen that this administration has had a goal of reducing spending on public education sort of from the get-go, but I don't think that that's necessarily explicitly the goal of a lot of the legislature. But I think that and I think when we look at it, so we've looked at this and JFO has as well, the Joint Fiscal Office has looked at this as well, to say that education spending over time has been flat adjusted for inflation, even when you account for declining enrollment. So I want to say that, again, like overall, we're spending the same share of our resources on public education as we have for the last 20 years. Even when you account for per pupil decline, we're talking about around a 1% increase in per pupil spending per year. So not really a huge significant, like we are seeing the student teacher ratios pretty much stay the same over time, meaning that we are kind of right sizing as the student population declines. So I want to make that really clear. So it's not that we're spending more on public education or even putting a greater share of our resources toward public education. It's the way the taxes are being distributed among people that are causing the pinch to be felt. I mean, there's always going to be people who are going to resist any increase in taxes. I mean, I think that's sort of human nature to not want your bills to go up, period, no matter what the bill might be, right? But I think there's also but it's how they're distributed. What we're seeing is more and more are being shifted onto low and moderate income people because the income sensitivity thresholds have gotten out of whack. So even though the total overall investment is the same, who's picking up the cost is changing, and that's where I think the squeeze is, and that's where the disconnect is. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's some willful conflation of those two things. And I think there's some genuine concern over I mean, those two things are clearly connected, right? It's not that there's no relationship between those two things. So I think from our perspective, when we talk about the cost drivers, a lot of what we're talking about there is the costs that are out of district's control. Like preserving the flexibility of districts to have some flexibility in their budgets and be able to make their own decisions, and recognize that there are certain costs that are out of district control, things like mental health care, things like transportation costs, but and especially teacher health care, right? Educator health care, that are really different from district to district. So how do we smooth those in a way that we're not squeezing some districts more than others or asking them to contribute more than others because they have particular circumstances that mean that they're particularly harmed by some of those things. So I don't want to we are not at all sort of dismissive of the fact that certain taxpayers, certain groups of taxpayers are getting squeezed more than others and more than they were in the past. Certain districts are getting squeezed more than others. And so how do we separate those things? And I think it really is about more parsing out more finely where the problems are and not just having this sort of really writ large, we think of the foundation approach, moving to a foundation approach as a pretty blunt instrument for solving what might be narrower problems that we can take, the tax relief we can take. If there are districts that really need more resources, that was part of the goal of the people waiting was to target that. We haven't really even let that work. We haven't really let that be implemented before we're up, changing it all again. So I think there's a lot of, that there, it's not to say that the only problem is tax relief and that's what we should be focused on. There are other problems, but I'm not sure any of them necessitate this kind of large scale upheaval. So I don't know if I actually answered your main question. Did I get the thread? Okay.
Great. Thanks, Jared. Matt, I see your hand and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for the information. I think I just have a comment and then a follow-up question. Following up on Jared's comment, I think it's not just the conflation that's the problem. It's that with all respect, it's the lack of pushback to the conflation once it's put out there, right? I do believe, having talked to legislators, that there is an understanding that things are being conflated and that it's unfortunate. Some people would say it's unfortunate and that they have some sense of understanding of what it is you just described, Steph, but there's a challenge, difficulty of finding the voice to say, actually, it's not that, it's something else. And that articulation, that verbalization, that political flag planting has I think, been a challenge or strategic choice on the part of legislators in terms of how to provide an alternative narrative. But that's a conversation perhaps for another day and another Zoom gathering. I would ask Katrina, I'd ask a follow-up question to your presentation. Again, thank you for your for the encapsulation, the comments. I want a CR. So that's like the best possible outcome of likely possibilities. I'd ask you to go a little farther as to where your intel comes from, or what, could you explain a little more about why you think a CR is a potential or likely outcome of the actual budget discussion, not the initial ones we're having now, but when they actually get to the budget? If you could, if I heard you right, if you could just say a little bit more about that and to the extent that you're able or comfortable, where your intel about that comes from. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think nobody knows what's going to happen, myself certainly included. I don't even think the legislators know what's going to happen. But when you look at the timeline for getting bills passed and how far the House is from the Senate, even still, there's been very little negotiating. There's been very few, if any, votes in the House. So I think in terms of what's most likely for at least a stopgap, if not longer, would be a continuing resolution, just in the sense that they don't have to have these negotiations. They don't have to come together and agree on these bills. So that's the assumption behind a CR. But again, who really knows?
But no, I would agree based on my tracking and my experience on the Hill and so on, that does logically, logistically seem like the most logical outcome. Of course, given how unlogical the last 6-9 months have been, it's hard to use logic and past as predictions for the future. Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate the additional information.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. And the only other thing that I would add about a CR is that, typically full appropriations bills do include congressionally directed spending, which is funding specifically targeted for projects in Vermont. CRs generally don't include this, so this could mean further funding losses for the state of Vermont. And let me pull up, we have a chart on this as well. Um, so you can see that's, generally in the hundreds of millions of dollars going directly to the state, especially when Senator Leahy was the chair of appropriations. He was very great at getting the state money. So from that angle, it's CR may be the best option we have. Also, in some ways, it's still a bad option. Just keeping things depressing still.
Yes. And I think Katrina, I mean, it's also recent history, right? Like the reason CRs are easier to pass is because there has to be less negotiation and less agreement. And clearly I did note that in Jared's comments, he did make a distinction between rational and political, which does seem like a pretty pretty big difference sometimes, some pretty big space between those two things. But but and just looking at recent history, how, most years we haven't had a full year budget bill very early on in the budget year, if at all. So that oftentimes we're facing these CR stopgap measures, sometimes multiple of them in one year to kind of until we can get to a place where there's room or will or whatever to do the harder negotiations.